The Luftwaffe intelligence officers believed they had everything figured out. Through meticulous study of reconnaissance photos, analysis of gun camera recordings, and careful examination of every aerial engagement, German Fighter Command thought they understood exactly what they faced when attacking American B-17 bombers over Europe. According to their assessments, each flying fortress carried defensive weaponry in known, predictable locations. The dorsal turret positioned above the aircraft's body contained 2 guns. Another pair sat in the spherical ball turret underneath. 2 more defended from the tail section. Scattered throughout the fuselage, perhaps 4 or 5 additional hand-operated weapons could be found. In total, German intelligence estimated somewhere between 9 and 11 half-inch caliber defensive weapons aboard each bomber. This assessment led to a tactical doctrine that seemed sound: attack from directly ahead, where forward defensive capabilities remained minimal. At that angle, perhaps only a bombardier with a handheld weapon would return fire, and at combined closing velocities approaching 400 miles per hour, accurate shooting became virtually impossible. The technique called for closing to within 200 meters, unleashing a concentrated burst of 20mm cannon rounds into the cockpit and forward fuselage, then breaking away sharply before entering the engagement zones of the top and side gunners. Repeat the process. Simple, calculated, effective. On the morning of October 14, 1943, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Meyer received his mission briefing at the Luftwaffe base in Wiesbaden-Erbenheim. American 8th Air Force Headquarters had ordered another maximum effort operation. The target was Schweinfurt, a critical center for ball-bearing manufacturing. Intelligence projected approximately 300 B-17s would participate in the raid. Fighter escorts would be limited because the American P-47 Thunderbolt lacked sufficient range to accompany the bombers throughout the entire mission. Meyer had accumulated extensive combat experience since 1940. He'd flown over England during the Battle of Britain, served in the Mediterranean theater, and now found himself defending German airspace against the escalating American daylight bombing offensive. He understood B-17 formations intimately. The Americans flew tight combat box arrangements designed to concentrate their defensive firepower. Individual bombers that strayed from formation became easy prey. Those maintaining proper discipline presented challenges, certainly, but nothing insurmountable. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters from his unit taxied through pre-dawn darkness toward the runway. Meyer's aircraft carried 13mm machine guns mounted forward of the cockpit and 20mm cannons built into the wing roots. Some newer aircraft in the squadron featured even heavier armament, including a single 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. These enhanced weapons had become necessary because American bombers proved remarkably resilient. German intelligence calculated that destroying a B-17 from the rear required an average of 20 direct hits from 20mm cannon fire. From the front, where armor remained thinner and crew compartments more concentrated, perhaps only 4 or 5 well-placed shells would suffice. This mathematical reality made frontal attack standard Luftwaffe doctrine against American formations. Meyer lifted into the grey October sky. His squadron assembled at altitude, while ground controllers radioed continuous updates about the American formation's position and heading. More than 300 Luftwaffe fighters from 24 different bases were being vectored toward the incoming bombers. This would represent the largest defensive effort the Luftwaffe had yet mounted against an American raid. What Meyer and his fellow pilots didn't yet know was that the bombers approaching Schweinfurt that morning differed significantly from those encountered in previous engagements. The Americans had modified their tactics, their formations, and most critically, their aircraft in ways German intelligence hadn't fully recognized. The calculations about defensive armament were about to prove catastrophically incorrect. The story actually begins not on that October morning, but 9 years earlier in August 1934, when a prototype aircraft emerged from Boeing's Seattle manufacturing facility. designated the Model 299. Boeing had designed this aircraft to meet United States Army Air Corps requirements for a multi-engine bomber capable of carrying a 2,000-pound bomb load across 2,000 miles at 200 miles per hour. When a journalist from the Seattle Times observed the aircraft during its initial public appearance, he noticed the numerous machine gun positions protruding from the fuselage and coined a term that would define the aircraft throughout history: Flying Fortress. The name perfectly captured Boeing's marketing vision. This bomber could defend itself, a self-protecting weapon system hiring no fighter escorts to penetrate enemy territory. The original Model 299 mounted 5 machine guns. By 1941, when the United States entered the Second World War, the B-17C variant in Army Air Forces service carried 4.5-inch caliber machine guns plus 130 caliber weapon. This armament had been designed to counter fighter aircraft from the mid-1930s. Aircraft that attacked from behind and below, carried light armament, and lacked the speed and firepower to sustain attacks against defended bomber formations. The strategic doctrine seemed straightforward and, on paper, compelling. Heavy bombers flying in mutually supporting formations would create overlapping fields of fire. Any fighter attempting attack would face not one bomber's guns, but the combined defensive firepower of dozens of aircraft. The bomber would always penetrate to its target. Fighter escort, while potentially useful, wasn't considered essential. American air power theorists had developed this doctrine during the interwar years. These officers believed strategic bombing would prove decisive in future conflicts. They envisioned fleets of heavy bombers striking deep into enemy territory, destroying industrial capacity and breaking enemy will to resist. The bombers would be self-defending fortresses, immune to fighter interception through sheer volume of defensive fire. The British Royal Air Force tested this theory over Germany in 1939 and 1940. The results proved unambiguous. Unescorted daylight bombers suffered catastrophic losses when intercepted by German fighters. The RAF switched to night bombing operations, accepting reduced accuracy in exchange for improved survival rates. British commanders attempted to warn their American counterparts that daylight bombing without fighter escorts was unsustainable. The Americans disagreed. They believed their bombers superior to British designs. The B-17 was faster, better armed, and more rugged than anything in RAF inventory. The combat box formation, a defensive arrangement that would evolve throughout 1943, would create mutual support far more effective than anything the British had attempted. American bombardiers trained with the Norden bombsight could achieve precision that made daylight attacks worthwhile despite the risks. When the 8th Air Force began operations from England in August 1942, initial missions seemed to confirm American optimism. Early raids against targets in occupied France encountered limited fighter opposition. Losses remained manageable. Bombers hit their targets and returned to base. The doctrine appeared sound, but occupied France was not Germany. Luftwaffe fighter strength in Western Europe during summer 1942 was limited. German fighter units were primarily deployed on the Eastern Front supporting ground operations against the Soviet Union. The Mediterranean theater demanded additional resources. Home defense of the Reich itself fell to a relatively small number of fighter squadrons equipped with aircraft diverted from other fronts. This situation would change as the American bombing campaign intensified, as targets moved deeper into German airspace, as the strategic threat to German industry became impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe would shift resources to counter the daylight bombing offensive. The Americans would discover their doctrine had been tested against an enemy operating at a fraction of its potential strength. Luftwaffe pilots who began encountering B-17 formations in significant numbers during 1943 were experienced combat aviators. Many had fought over England during the Battle of Britain. Others had accumulated hundreds of missions on the Eastern Front. They approached the challenge of intercepting American bomber formations with tactical sophistication developed through years of air combat. Their aircraft were formidable. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, introduced to combat in late 1941, ranked among the finest piston engine fighters of the war. Fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, continuously upgraded throughout the conflict, remained an effective interceptor. Both aircraft mounted combinations of machine guns and cannons that gave them striking power far exceeding anything on Allied fighters during the early war years. German pilots developed specific tactics for attacking bomber formations. Initial approaches favored attacks from the rear and below, where the bomber's belly turret had limited traverse and where the aircraft's tail could shield approaching fighters from defensive fire. Pilots learned to coordinate their attacks, with one element engaging from one direction while another struck from a different angle, dividing the bomber's defensive attention. But the Americans adapted. The combat box formation evolved to provide better mutual support. Bomber groups staggered their altitudes and positions to eliminate blind spots. The 8th Air Force worked to improve defensive gunnery training, teaching gunners to lead their targets properly and coordinate fire across multiple aircraft. Gun camera footage from returned missions was analyzed to identify effective defensive techniques, and the bomber itself was changing. Field modifications appeared on B-17s returning from combat missions. Armorers installed additional machine guns in the nose compartment, where bombardiers had previously relied on single handheld weapons. Some aircraft received reinforced armor around critical crew positions. The aircraft that German intelligence had assessed in 1942 was being systematically improved. Based on combat experience. German intelligence officers tracked these modifications through multiple sources. Crashed American aircraft were examined in detail. Photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft showed modifications to surviving bombers. Debriefings of Luftwaffe pilots after each engagement provided additional data. The intelligence picture showed American bombers becoming more heavily armed, but the information remained incomplete and often contradictory. Reports from different fighter units described varying numbers and positions of defensive weapons. Some pilots reported seeing additional machine guns mounted in cheek positions beside the bombardier station. Others described chin turrets, remotely operated gun positions mounted below the nose. The reports were fragmented, collected from pilots who had seen the bombers only at combat speeds, often while maneuvering violently to avoid defensive fire or press home attacks. German intelligence assessments from mid-1943 credited the B-17 with approximately 9 to 12 defensive machine guns depending on specific variant and field modifications. This represented a significant increase from earlier assessments, but remained within bounds of what Luftwaffe pilots considered manageable. The fundamental tactical approach remained valid: attack from ahead where defensive firepower was weakest. Use superior speed to close quickly while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. Deliver concentrated burst of cannon fire into the vulnerable nose and cockpit area. Break away before dorsal and waist gunners could track effectively. This tactical approach had produced results. Throughout summer and early fall of 1943, Luftwaffe fighter units defending Germany inflicted severe losses on American bomber formations. On June 13th, an attack on Bremen cost the Americans 26 bombers from a force of 228, a loss rate exceeding 11%. On June 22nd, the raid on the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant at Hulls cost 20 bombers. The trend continued. American losses on deep penetration raids without fighter escort averaged 10 to 15%. At that attrition rate, the 8th Air Force could not sustain its bombing campaign. Something would have to change. Either the Americans would develop long-range fighter escorts, abandon daylight strategic bombing, or find some way to make their bombers more survivable against fighter attack. The Boeing B-17G entered production in summer 1943. The G designation represented the culmination of continuous improvements based on combat feedback from the 8th Air Force. Every modification addressed a specific vulnerability identified in combat operations over occupied Europe and Germany. The most significant change was addition of a remotely operated chin turret mounted below the bombardier's position in the nose. This Bendix-designed turret contained a Browning M to half-inch caliber machine guns with 1,460 rounds of ammunition. The bombardier operated the turret through a control system that allowed him to traverse and elevate the weapons while maintaining his primary responsibilities for navigation to the target and bomb release. The chin turret eliminated the bomber's most critical vulnerability. German pilots had exploited the B-17E and B-17F models' weak forward defense by perfecting head-on attacks. A fighter approaching from 12 o'clock high would encounter only handheld weapons operated by bombardier or navigator, weapons difficult to aim accurately at closing speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The chin turret changed this calculation fundamentally. Now a fighter making a head-on approach faced a fixed, remotely aimed machine guns specifically designed to cover that attack vector. But the chin turret was only part of the B-17G's enhanced defensive armament. The aircraft also featured two cheek-mounted machine guns, one on each side of the nose compartment. These single weapons, operated by navigator and bombardier respectively, covered forward quarter approaches that the chin turret could not reach. The cheek guns were mounted in flexible ball sockets, allowing wide traverse angles. The dorsal turret above and behind the flight deck contained two machine guns operated by the flight engineer. This redesigned turret could rotate 360 degrees and elevate to cover attacks from above and from the sides. The turret's powered traverse system could rotate at 50 degrees per second, fast enough to track fighters making high-speed firing passes. Below the fuselage, between the bomb bay and tail section, the ball turret provided defensive coverage against attacks from below. This Sperry ball turret was perhaps the most innovative defensive position on the aircraft. The gunner entered through a hatch in the fuselage, then rotated the spherical turret to position himself in a semi-fetal posture with his back against a pad and his feet in stirrups. The turret could rotate 360 degrees in azimuth and traverse nearly 180 degrees in elevation. Two machine guns mounted on either side of the gunner provided firepower. The position was cramped, cold, and psychologically demanding, but it eliminated the blind spots that earlier bombers had suffered when attacked from below. The radio operator's position, located behind the bomb bay in the upper fuselage, included a single machine gun that could be deployed through an opening in the roof. This weapon covered the area between the dorsal turret and the tail, preventing fighters from exploiting gaps in defensive coverage. Two waist gunners manned flexible machine guns mounted on opposite sides of the rear fuselage. In the B-17G, these positions were staggered rather than directly opposite each other, allowing the gunners more room to operate without interfering with each other's movements. Each waist position had 1,200 rounds of ammunition, the largest allocation for any defensive position on the aircraft. The tail gunner occupied a remote position at the extreme rear of the fuselage. His position, separated from the rest of the crew, contained two machine guns with 565 rounds each. The tail position was critical for defense against the most common attack angle, the classic fighter approach from 6 o'clock level or slightly below. Total defensive armament: 13 Browning M to half-inch caliber machine guns. Total ammunition load: approximately 7,500 rounds. The Browning M to half-inch caliber machine gun was a mature, reliable weapon by 1943. John Browning had designed the original prototype near the end of World War I in response to a request for a weapon capable of penetrating light armor and defeating aircraft at range. The design had been refined throughout the 1920s and 30s, resulting in a weapon that balanced hitting power, reliability, and weight. The M2 fired a 12.7mm cartridge with a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. The standard ammunition load included several types of rounds loaded in mixed belts. Tracer rounds, identified by red painted tips, allowed gunners to observe their fire and adjust their aim. Armor-piercing rounds with black painted tips could penetrate light armor at combat ranges. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds marked with silver tips combined penetration capability with incendiary effects designed to ignite fuel and ammunition. Standard ball ammunition provided general-purpose capability. The effective range of the M2, when mounted on a B-17, was approximately 600 yards. Beyond that distance, the combination of aircraft motion, target motion, and ballistic drop made accurate fire nearly impossible, even with the improved gun sights introduced during 1943. Within that 600-yard envelope, however, the weapon was formidable. A single half-inch round carried sufficient energy to damage aircraft structures, disable engines, and injure or kill crew members. Rate of fire was approximately 750 rounds per minute, though sustained fire rates were lower due to the need to change ammunition belts and prevent barrel overheating. Gunners were trained to fire in short bursts of 5 to 7 rounds rather than holding the trigger continuously. This discipline conserved ammunition and maintained barrel life while delivering effective fire. The Defensive Gunnery School at Laredo Army Airfield in Texas trained B-17 gunners through a progressive program that began with ground instruction and culminated in aerial gunnery exercises. Students learned to calculate lead angles, the angular offset necessary to compensate for relative motion between bomber and attacking fighter. At typical engagement ranges and speeds, proper lead angles could exceed 30 degrees for beam attacks. Where the fighter passed perpendicular to the bomber's flight path, gunners also learned to coordinate their fire with other defensive positions. A fighter attacking from 11 o'clock high might be engaged simultaneously by the chin turret, left cheek gun, and dorsal turret. The overlapping fire from multiple positions increased the probability of scoring hits and created a psychological effect that often caused attacking pilots to break off prematurely. The transition from B-17F to B-17G was not instantaneous. Across the 8th Air Force, different bomb groups received the new variants at different times as production increased and aircraft were ferried across the Atlantic. By October 1943, approximately 30% of B-17s in England were G models. By December, that percentage had increased to roughly 60%. By March 1944, the vast majority of operational B-17s in the European theatre were G models. German intelligence tracked these changes, but the intelligence picture remained incomplete. Luftwaffe pilots reported seeing bombers with nose turrets, but the reports were inconsistent. Some bomber formations appeared to include aircraft with the new armament, while others did not. German intelligence analysts concluded correctly that the Americans were introducing improved variants, but they did not immediately grasp the full extent of the changes. The assessment that would matter, the assessment that would determine Luftwaffe tactics and pilot survival rates, was not being made in intelligence offices. It was being made in the cockpits of Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt fighters as they closed to attack American bomber formations. The pilots would discover the truth about B-17G armament through direct experience. Many would not survive the lesson. The mission brief on the morning of October 14, 1943 specified Schweinfurt as the primary target. The ball-bearing manufacturing plants there produced an estimated 40 to 55% of Germany's total ball-bearing output. Planners at 8th Air Force headquarters believed that destroying these facilities would cripple German armament production within 4 months. The raid would be a maximum effort involving 291 B-17 flying fortresses from 13 bomb groups. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Meyer and his squadron mates from Jagdgeschwader 1 received their intercept vectors at approximately noon. The American formation was approaching from the northwest on a heading that would take them across Belgium and into German airspace near Aachen. Fighter controllers calculated that the bombers would reach Schweinfurt between 2:30 and 3 in the afternoon. The Luftwaffe committed over 300 fighters from 24 different bases to intercept the raid. The defensive effort was coordinated through ground-based radar stations and fighter control centers that tracked the American formation's progress and directed fighter units to intercept positions. Unlike previous engagements where German fighters had engaged piecemeal, this would be a concentrated, sustained assault along the entire route to the target and back. Mayer's unit made first contact with the American formation on the German border at approximately 1 in the afternoon. The bombers were flying in their standard combat box formation, staggered altitudes creating a three-dimensional defensive arrangement. The escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts from 8th Air Force fighter groups, were at the limit of their range and would soon have to turn back. Mayer positioned his swarm, a 4-aircraft tactical formation, for a head-on attack against the lead combat box. This was standard doctrine: approach from 12 o'clock high, diving slightly to build speed, open fire at 300 meters with machine guns and cannons, continue firing until 200 meters, then brake hard left or right to avoid collision and escape the bomber's defensive fire zone as quickly as possible. He selected his target, a B-17 flying in the lead position of the high squadron. The bomber appeared identical to the fortresses he had attacked in previous engagements. As he closed, he could see the distinctive nose glazing, the bombardier station, where a man would be crouched over his Norden bomb site, preparing for the bomb run that was still an hour away. At 400 meters, Mayer pressed his firing button. Tracers from his machine guns and bright flashes from his cannons marked his line of fire. He was aiming for the cockpit and nose section where the bomber's pilots and bombardier worked. At this range and at his closing speed of nearly 500 miles per hour, the engagement would last less than 3 seconds. What happened next was something Mayer had never experienced in hundreds of combat missions. The bomber's nose erupted with muzzle flashes, not the single handheld gun he expected, but multiple weapons firing simultaneously. Tracers arced toward him in brilliant orange-red streams. His windscreen starred with impacts. Something struck his engine cowling with a metallic bang that he heard even over the roar of his own weapons firing. He broke left reflexively, abandoning his attack run before reaching optimal firing range. His wingman's aircraft, visible in his peripheral vision, staggered as rounds struck home. Smoke began streaming from the FW-190's engine. The aircraft rolled inverted and began a spiraling descent. Mayer never saw whether his wingman recovered control or whether the aircraft crashed. He was too busy dealing with his own damaged fighter and trying to process what had just happened. The bomber he had attacked remained in formation, apparently undamaged. The American formation continued toward Schweinfurt, defensive guns tracking outward toward the German fighters that circled at a distance, preparing for the next attack. The bombers continued their approach to Schweinfurt through sustained German fighter attacks that lasted over 3 hours. Luftwaffe pilots pressed their assaults with determination, born of desperation. They understood that American bombers penetrating this deep into Germany represented an existential threat to the Reich's war-making capacity. But the nature of their attacks had changed. Head-on approaches, once the preferred tactic, now resulted in defensive fire far more intense than anything German pilots had previously encountered. The chin turret, the cheek guns, and the coordinated fire from multiple B-17s in formation created a wall of tracers that forced attacking fighters to break off earlier or accept losses that were rapidly becoming unsustainable. German pilots adapted their tactics during the engagement. Some units reverted to attacks from the rear and below, accepting the longer exposure to defensive fire in exchange for avoiding the concentrated forward firepower. Others attempted beam attacks, diving through the formation from the side at high speed to minimize exposure time. A few pilots, armed with 21-centimeter unguided rockets, attempted to engage from beyond the effective range of the bomber's defensive guns, though the rockets proved inaccurate and unreliable. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, the lead bomber groups reached Schweinfurt and began their bombing runs. The bombardiers had to fly straight and level during the final approach to the target, making the bombers most vulnerable to both flak and fighter attack. German anti-aircraft batteries around the city opened fire, adding to the defensive barrage that the bombers had already endured during their approach. 229 B-17s dropped their bombs on the city and the ball-bearing plants. The bombing was reasonably accurate by the standards of 1943. Several direct hits were scored on factory buildings. Fires erupted across the industrial district. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs would later show significant damage to some production facilities, but the cost was catastrophic. As the bombers turned for home, still fighting their way through Luftwaffe interceptors, the losses continued to mount. Damaged aircraft fell out of formation, becoming easy targets for German fighters. Bombers with dead or wounded pilots struggled to maintain altitude and position. Aircraft with engines shot out or control surfaces damaged limped westward, some crash landing in occupied territory, others ditching in the English Channel. Of the 291 B-17s that had set out that morning, 60 did not return to their bases in England. Another 17 were so heavily damaged that they would never fly again, written off as total losses, despite making it back. 121 additional aircraft returned with varying degrees of battle damage. The numbers were stark. Over 26% of the attacking force had been destroyed or rendered non-operational. 650 men were listed as killed, missing, or captured. 22% of the bomber crews who had climbed into their aircraft that morning would not return. For the 8th Air Force, the losses were devastating, but not unexpected. Planners had known that deep penetration raids without fighter escort would be costly. What shocked commanders was that despite the improved defensive armaments on the B-17G models, despite the combat box formations, despite improved gunnery training, the bombers still could not defend themselves adequately against determined fighter attack. General Henry Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces from Washington, initially attempted to characterize the loss of 60 bombers as incidental to the larger strategic picture. But the reality was undeniable. At this rate of attrition, the 8th Air Force would be destroyed before it could accomplish its strategic objectives. Deep penetration daylight bombing raids into Germany was suspended. They would not resume until February 1944, and only then with long-range fighter escorts that could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back for the Luftwaffe. October 14th, 1943 represented a tactical victory, but the beginning of a strategic catastrophe. German pilots and anti-aircraft batteries had destroyed or damaged a significant portion of the attacking force. The bombers had been turned back, at least temporarily. German newspapers proclaimed a great defensive victory. Luftwaffe pilots who had scored victories were decorated and celebrated, but the cost had been far higher than German commanders acknowledged publicly. Luftwaffe losses on October 14th were approximately 35 to 38 aircraft destroyed, with additional aircraft damaged. More critically, experienced pilots were killed or wounded at a rate that German training programs could not replace. Unlike aircraft, which could be manufactured in factories, skilled fighter pilots required months or years of training and combat experience to develop. The defensive firepower that German pilots encountered over Schweinfurt had exceeded their expectations and their intelligence assessments. Multiple Luftwaffe pilots reported being surprised by the volume and accuracy of defensive fire from American bombers. Post-mission debriefs included descriptions of bombers that appeared to have gun positions in every direction that could bring concentrated fire to bear regardless of the attack angle. German intelligence officers began compiling more detailed assessments of B-17 armament based on these combat reports. By December 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence had revised its estimates upward. The latest American bomber variants were now assessed to carry between 12 and 13 defensive machine guns. This was nearly double the armament on the B-17E and early F models that had first appeared over Europe in significant numbers. The Luftwaffe attempted to counter the improved American defensive firepower through several initiatives. Fighter units began upgrading their armament, adding heavier cannons that could engage bombers from beyond the effective range of defensive machine guns. The 30mm Mk-108 cannon could destroy a heavy bomber with 4 or 5 well-placed hits, though its low muzzle velocity made accurate shooting difficult. Some FW-190 variants were equipped with additional armor plates to protect pilots during frontal attacks, creating the Sternbock or battering ram versions designed specifically for attacking bomber formations. But these modifications came too late and in insufficient numbers. The fundamental problem facing the Luftwaffe was one of mathematics and industrial capacity. Even if German fighters could maintain favorable kill ratios against American bombers, the Americans could replace their losses far more quickly than Germany could replace aircraft and especially pilots. The United States was producing heavy bombers at a rate that exceeded German fighter production by substantial margins. When deep penetration raids resumed in February 1944, during what would become known as Big Week, the situation changed fundamentally. American long-range fighters, primarily P-51 Mustangs equipped with drop tanks, could now escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany. The Luftwaffe fighters that had previously concentrated their efforts against bombers now found themselves engaged by Allied fighters with performance equal or superior to German aircraft and with pilots who were increasingly well-trained and experienced. The air battle over Germany in the first half of 1944 became a war of attrition that Germany could not win. From January through May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,000 fighters in combat over the Reich and occupied territories. Pilot losses during the same period were catastrophic. General Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters, estimated that Luftwaffe day fighter losses from December 1943 through March 1944 amounted to approximately 1,000 aircraft in combat with an equivalent number lost in training and ferry accidents. Experienced pilots, the squadron and flight leaders who provided tactical expertise and leadership, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe was a spent force. On D-Day, the German fighter forces in France could muster only 160 aircraft, of which only 80 were operational. The story of the B-17's defensive armament is ultimately a story about adaptation and industrial capacity. The Boeing engineers who designed the original Model 299 in 1934 could not have anticipated the air war that would develop over Europe nearly a decade later. The aircraft evolved through continuous modification based on combat experience, growing from 5 machine guns to 13 through a process of iterative improvement driven by necessity. But the deeper truth revealed by the Schweinfurt raids and the air war over Germany is that defensive armament, no matter how extensive, could not solve the fundamental problem facing unescorted bombers. Even 13 machine guns, even tight defensive formations, even well-trained gunners could not prevent determined fighter attacks from inflicting unsustainable losses. The solution was not more guns on the bombers. The solution was fighter escorts with the range to accompany the bombers throughout their missions. The P-51 Mustang, when equipped with drop tanks that extended its combat radius to over 850 miles, fundamentally changed the strategic bombing campaign. The arrival of long-range escorts in significant numbers during early 1944 meant that American bombers no longer had to rely solely on their defensive armament for survival. The fighters could engage German interceptors before they reached the bomber formations, could protect stragglers and damaged aircraft, and could pursue German fighters that attempted to break off combat and return to their bases. The 13 machine guns on the B-17G remained important. They forced German fighters to respect the bomber formations, prevented casual attacks, and inflicted losses on fighters that pressed their attacks too aggressively. But the guns were a component of a larger defensive system that included formation discipline, fighter escorts, electronic countermeasures against German radar, and the sheer industrial capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. For the men who flew in B-17s over Germany, the defensive guns represented a psychological necessity as much as a tactical one. Unlike bomber crews in the Pacific theater, who sometimes flew missions in aircraft stripped of most defensive armament to increase speed and bomb load, European bomber crews needed to feel they could fight back. The ability to man a gun, to see tracers reaching out toward attacking fighters, to potentially damage or destroy an attacker, made the experience of being attacked marginally more bearable. The statistics on bomber defensive gunnery effectiveness are sobering. Bomber gunners claimed thousands of German fighters destroyed during the air campaign over Europe. Actual verified losses to bomber defensive fire were far lower, perhaps 10 to 15% of the claims. The discrepancy is understandable. Multiple gunners would fire at the same fighter, and each would claim the victory. Fighters that broke off attacks trailing smoke have been only lightly damaged, but were claimed as destroyed. The confusion of combat, the speed of engagements, and the genuine difficulty of assessing results from gun camera footage or a gunner's memory all contributed to overclaiming. But effectiveness cannot be measured solely in aircraft destroyed. The defensive guns forced German fighters to modify their tactics, to accept greater risks, to break off attacks earlier than they might have preferred. The psychological effect of flying into streams of tracer fire, of knowing that hundreds of machine guns were tracking you, cannot be quantified, but was undoubtedly significant. The lesson of the B-17's defensive armament evolution is clear. Technology alone cannot guarantee survival in combat. Adaptation, integration of lessons learned, industrial capacity, and combined arms coordination all played essential roles.